Hi, welcome to the first of two lectures on realistic group conflict theory. The last set of lectures looked at the theory of authoritarianism, which is a personality-based explanation for prejudice. And you'll recall that one of the shortcomings of that theory was that it battled to account for the collective nature of racism. Why would all of a sudden, for example, in the Holocaust, so many people together act in a prejudiced and racist manner? What is it really that they all had the same child-rearing experiences? We're going to consider in this lecture by way of example, the Rwandan genocide. In 1994, from the 6th of April, for about 100 days, 800,000 Tutsis were murdered by their neighbors, the Hutus at that time. And the shocking thing about this, it was mainly neighbors murdering neighbors, people in the same village, and it was at close quarters with machetes. People bludgeoned their neighbors to death in great numbers in 100 days. So why would an event like this happen? Is it likely that all these individuals had authoritarian upbringing, they had all this repressed hate, that now the situation came for them to express it? Why would it all of a sudden be this situation, this context, that this hatred becomes expressed? So these instances where people act collectively together in group conflict and in racist and prejudicial ways gets us to ask questions about, well, what can explain this? What can account for this, the collective nature of racism? And the theory that we're going to consider here, realistic group conflict theory, suggests that the cause lies in the history of relations between groups. So the beliefs that we have about others, the stereotypes, the attitudes we have towards members of other groups comes from or is rooted in the history of relationships between our group and their group, especially, as we'll see later, in terms of competition for scarce resources, in terms of material advantage and disadvantage. And so really what this theory does, it inverts the kind of explanation that the theory of authoritarianism proposed. Authoritarianism is an individual theory. It starts off with prejudice. This prejudice is developed in early childhood, and then this prejudice produces group conflict. Realistic group conflict theory is a group-based theory, and it starts the other way around. It says we first have to look at the history of conflict between groups, the history of the relationships between groups, and prejudice flows from or is a consequence of this. A central feature of this history of relationships between groups is competition for scarce resources. If you take a look in any society, we'll see groups that have more advantaged groups and groups that are disadvantaged or have less. Societies are organized in social hierarchies. And it's competition for resources that leads to prejudice, according to Sharif's theory. Take for an example, just to illustrate the meaning or the understanding of scarce resources. Take, for example, places in a lifeboat. Say the ship goes down, you're on a ship, the ship sinks, and you scramble onto a lifeboat, and the lifeboat can only take 10 people. One more person gets in that lifeboat, all 10 are going to sink. It cannot take 11. Now, there are 10 of you already on the lifeboat, and someone swims up to that lifeboat, tries to get on. What do? If you let that person on, all of you are going to drown. How do you make a decision who's going to be on that lifeboat and who's going to be off the lifeboat? Do you beat that person away and say, no, you drown, we're going to survive, us 10 over here? How do we make that decision? Well, one way in which people make that decision is by some kind of rule. Like, for example, first come, first serve. So, sorry, the lifeboat is full, go away. Another way in which people make the decision how to distribute scarce resources is on group membership. And in fact, if you take a look at the results of who survived the Titanic, take a look at the proportion of men that survived the Titanic compared to the proportion of women compared to the proportion of children. And we see that the decision who's going to get access to those lifeboat places was certainly made on the basis of group membership. It was women that took the lifeboat places. Obviously the ideology there is that women are first, women deserve it, and the men will stay behind. So we can see there's a group-based thinking in how scarce resources are distributed. And that's not only true of places on a lifeboat, that's much more true of things that happen in everyday society as well, in terms of jobs and land and wealth, etc., etc. You often see that advantage and disadvantage in society is associated with group membership. And this is certainly the case in the Rwandan genocide. We can only understand that genocide according to Mamdani if we understand the history of the relationships between Hutus and Tutsis in the context of colonialism. The Belgian colonists advantaged the Tutsis. They treated the Tutsis as somehow a superior race, a superior group of people. The Tutsis did well under colonialism. They had jobs in government, in the civil service, etc. And the Hutus were viewed as some lower group of people. Of course, when the Belgian colonists left, then the Hutus took power, but there was always the sense that the Tutsis were foreigners. They owned stuff, they had advantages that they didn't deserve, that the history of the relationships between groups in colonialism had structured, and the competition for scarce resources, for material resources in that context, had structured the relationships and had produced a scenario in which prejudice could proliferate, in which certain group stereotypes could become active. For example, in the killings, in the genocide, the Hutus referred to the Tutsis as cockroaches. They don't deserve to be here, they're foreigners, they're aliens. And so this is what realistic group conflict theory proposes. At the heart of Sharif's theory is this idea that the attitudes, the beliefs that we have about other groups, the stereotypes, reflect the interests, the objective interests of one group vis-a-vis, or a group vis-a-vis another group. So when we talk about objective interests, we're talking about interests in terms of material resources, things like jobs, schooling, etc., objective things. And it's this history of competition that is fundamental in producing collective levels of prejudice. And so the theory argues that attitudes and behaviors are explained not at the level of individual prejudices, not at the level of childhood, your upbringing, your parents, etc., but at big things that are happening in group life as a whole, at a supra-individual group level. And the vital element here is competition for scarce resources determines intergroup relations. So in situations where groups are competing for scarce resources, and there will be attitudes and stereotypes representing their position in that competition. And then thirdly, that the attitudes, the beliefs, the feelings that people have then depend on this history of interrelations, this history of objective group interests. And there seems to be much to recommend this theory. If you take a look, for example, in South Africa, can you think of objective resources? Can you think of resources that, say for example, race groups historically have competed for, that they continue to compete for today? Here we're thinking things, for example, like jobs, land, places in education, water, good places to stay, health services. These are objective resources, and certainly these are unequally distributed. And take, for example, affirmative action. You can see very clearly how group interests and stereotypes are rooted in competition for jobs. So, as social psychologists normally do, they investigate these things using experiments. In our next lecture, we're going to look at an experiment in which that Sharif conducted to see how competition produces prejudice.